Battles fought for the control of the world's oceans are marked by no monuments, no watery reminders of the momentous military and commercial importance of sea power. The wish to explore, the decision to colonize, the necessity to trade combined to create empires that determined the shape of the modern world. The story of sea power is more than the story of men and some of the most beautiful and deadly machines ever made by man. It is about the birth of superpower, which in the 20th century passed from one side of the Atlantic to the other, but remained the inheritance of the English-speaking peoples. Towards the end of his life, Otto von Bismarck, who as Chancellor of Prussia had created a united German Empire, was asked what would be the most important political reality of the 20th century. He replied, "The fact that America speaks English." His prediction was confirmed by the Allied victory in World War I, a war in which the importance of naval power had been obscured by the staggering casualties on land. Equally, a single battle of capital ships, Jutland, had obscured how the nature of naval war had changed. The gun had given way to the torpedo and the bomb.
Torpedoes give, if you like, flotilla vessels, small vessels, a battle capability for the first time. Up until William Whitehead's invention is perfected in the 1870s, it really is extremely difficult to, first off, to punch a hole in the bottom of a ship. But torpedoes are a different kind of beast entirely. They can be delivered to you in the dark of night at considerable speeds. Through the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the effective range of torpedoes increases quite significantly until in the years before the First World War, you can expect a torpedo attack at anything under 14,000 yards from the opposing fleet. It means that a lot of small vessels, the destroyer becomes the classic example, now have the ability to sink a battleship. And this really had never happened before. The idea of a small, high-speed vessel firing a torpedo in the dark of night put the fear into a lot of admirals, and it gave enormous power to small ships and to smaller navies that weren't built around battle fleets.
The small torpedo boat was vulnerable to larger and more heavily armed, but equally fast surface ships. What was needed was a torpedo carrier that could get close to the enemy without being seen or detected. That carrier turned out to be the submarine.
The torpedo gives a unique value to the submarine for the first time because as a concept, the submarine had been around for hundreds of years. They'd been used in the American Civil War. But they'd always lacked two crucial things. They lacked an effective weapon, which wouldn't sink the submarine at the same time it sank the vessel it attacked. And it lacked a system of propulsion. And it limits the value of the combination of submarine and torpedo until the invention of the diesel engine. And they go into subs just before the First World War. And with a diesel-electric propulsion system in submarines, you finally have that whole weapon system coming together. And that's just in the years before the First World War. But the people who pull it together were the Germans.
In World War I, Germany's initial plans were to use submarines as the hidden eyes of the high seas fleet. But when a German submarine, the U-9, happened upon 3 aging British cruisers, it was quickly able to torpedo one. The other 2 cruisers assumed a boiler explosion and stood by to assist. The submarine then sank each in turn. That changed the war plan. Submarines operating against Allied shipping in the Atlantic sank over 5,000 ships, 1/4 of the world's tonnage, at a cost of 187 U-boats and their crews. The Germans had adopted the British tactic of blockade, But there was a crucial difference. Submarines, to prevent neutral ships from trading with the enemy, had to sink them.
The British blockade is arguably humane. It may be illegal under international law, but it's humane. The only recourse left to the Germans is to try to establish a similar economic blockade of Britain, but the only means they have to actually enforce that are submarines. And submarines can't capture ships as rule and take them into port. So the German response is an attempt at an economic blockade which is destructive of both life and property. And this is new. It outrages public opinion. It's something I think that anyone, had they been in the German situation, would have tried. And the Germans do try it repeatedly. They try it in 1915, the Lusitania goes down, they quit. They try it in 1916, they have problems with the Sussex and the Arabic incidents in the Channel, they quit because of international pressure. They finally get so fed up in the winter of 1916, 1917, they just say, well, the hell with it, we'll just do it. We'll establish the blockade, we'll take the consequences. And that's when the real major unrestricted submarine campaign starts.
Unrestricted U-boat warfare was reintroduced on February 1st, 1917, for the duration of the war. The Kaiser predicted Britain's doom, and the prediction came close to being realized. But the German decision had dangerous, if not unanticipated, results. The Americans had warned the Germans against submarine attacks on its shipping, and when these occurred, America entered the war against Germany. While German U-boats had failed to starve Britain into submission, they had come close. It ended the war as the weapon that British naval strategists most feared. In it, they saw the challenge of the future and a disturbing echo from the past when British privateers had humbled mighty Spain. A central provision of the Versailles Treaty ending the First World War insisted that Germany should not possess submarines in the future. World War I and the peace conference at Versailles had brought about a decline in British power that could not have been imagined 25 years earlier. Indeed, people as well informed as Lord Curzon, a member of the British cabinet, maintained that Britain was stronger than ever.
The British flag never flew over more powerful or united an empire than now. Britain's never had better cause to look the world in the face. Never did our voice count for more in the councils of the nations or in determining the future destinies of mankind. George Nathaniel Curzon.
In past wars, despite large expenditures, Britain had invariably emerged wealthier than before. But the massive cost of new technology, along with its rapid spread to other countries, had changed the rules of the game, to Britain's detriment.
It ends the First World War as a victor nation. It's on the right side. But A, the cost has been horrendous, not just in the loss of almost 1 million men of the British Empire forces, but the vast growth in national debt, which overhangs the economy all through the 30s. And more to the point, the center of finance moves from London to New York, and Great Britain becomes the world's greatest debtor nation. The United States becomes the world's greatest creditor nation.
The British Empire depended upon the Royal Navy's control of the seas, but the enormous cost of the war made the expense of the Navy ruinous. There was no thought of engaging in an armaments race comparable to that with Germany, which had preceded the war, particularly since two new rival powers had emerged, one across the Atlantic, the other in the Pacific.
Both Japan and the United States switched from being net debtor to net creditor nations between 1914 and 1919. And therefore the British government is desperate to head off a peacetime naval race, which would be at least as expensive as a naval race with Germany before 1914. It finds itself, however, trapped between its Japanese alliance, which the United States wants to be broken and finished with, and the need to conciliate the Americans, partly because of the debt issue, and partly because you do not want to get into a naval race with the country which is now by far the biggest industrial power of all time. So you have to satisfy the Americans by compromising with getting rid of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, agreeing not to build any naval bases at all in the Pacific and Far East, limiting the size of the fleet in a fixed ratio as between Britain and the US, equal but reduced, Japan in a fixed ratio, making it third largest naval power. We, the British, we're no longer the #1 naval power in the world. This is the first time in 250 years or so.
Conscious of the importance of the blockade that had strangled Germany and threatened England, one of Hitler's first military actions when he came to power in 1933 was to order 26 submarines. The intention was not to challenge the Royal Navy, but to pursue a strategy of commerce raiding, using both submarines and surface raiders, combined with enough large warships to keep as much as possible of Britain's fleet in their home ports. This policy was pursued with mixed results until the fall of France in 1940 gave the Germans possession of the French seaports on the Atlantic, vastly increasing the range of the German submarine fleet by giving their long-range U-boats easy access to the shipping lanes to and from Britain. Their problem was an insufficient number of U-boats.
Throughout the latter months of 1939 and the whole of 1940, the submarine German U-boats are having a major impact on transatlantic convoys. Admiral Dönitz, commander-in-chief of the German U-boat fleet, firmly believed that if he'd started the war with a sufficient number of U-boats, then the outcome would have been very different.
In the Atlantic, Germany engaged the Allies in the longest and grimmest battle of the Second World War, exceeded only in numbers of Allied casualties by the sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad. Part of the carnage was due to a weakness possessed by all convoy systems. Merchant ships and their protecting corvettes, frigates, and destroyers could move no faster than the slowest vessel in the convoy.
At the start of the war, the ability to find and destroy U-boats is fairly basic. Most U-boats operated on the surface. Many of them attacked at night under cover of darkness, getting inside a convoy. In an era where most ships didn't have radar, then the profile, the silhouette of a U-boat operating on the surface at night is extremely difficult to pick out. They have much success at this early stage.
The German U-boat success was a constant concern to Winston Churchill.
How willingly I would have exchanged a full-scale attempt at invasion for this shapeless, measureless peril expressed in charts, curves, and statistics. Winston Churchill.
by 1942-43, Churchill was scared stiff. He thought they were going to lose the Battle of the Atlantic and therefore lose the war itself. The worst losses of all are the convoy losses in the spring of 1943. And yet, with incredible swiftness, the tide turns in the Battle of the Atlantic. And I think we have to identify not one, but about 3 or 4 reasons for that. The coming of very long-range aircraft, ones which could fly out of Gander and Iceland and close the gap in the middle, because once you had aircraft all the time in the air around the convoy, they kept driving the submarines under the water, and therefore they became subject to detection, and they exhausted their batteries. Secondly, the creation of the small escort carriers. You put 2 or 3 Hurricane fighters on there, and it also goes up and protects the convoy in times of crisis. Thirdly, the British had created ever more sophisticated small-scale radar sets, so they could put them on warships, and they could therefore pick up German U-boats on the surface at night and then go and attack them. And the fourth thing, another kind of technological wonder of the Second World War, the British are reading Enigma decrypts, the secret coded messages, to and from Donitz's headquarters, so they know what they can anticipate. It looks terribly serious. In April 1943, it's defeated by July 1943. It's that swift.
In March of 1944, with U-boat losses still mounting, Donitz admitted defeat and recalled the wolf packs.
Our losses had reached an intolerable level, and the enemy air force played a decisive role in affecting these losses. Admiral Donitz.
By the end of the war, more than 30,000 Allied merchant seamen had been lost in the sinking of more than 2,600 ships. German submarine crews had also paid a terrible price. More than 28,000 U-boat men went down with their boats, a fatality rate of 70%, the highest of any service for any country in World War II. While the submarine determined the shape of the sea war in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, it was the aircraft carrier.
The assumption, up until 1921, was that aircraft carriers existed primarily to provide air support for the battleship fleet, and they were generally ships that displaced between 10 and 15,000 tons. Ships much smaller, for example, than the battleships they were designed to protect. But once the United States took a battle cruiser hull, a 33,000-ton displacement hull, put a flight deck on top, now it's a ship of an entirely new type. Eventually would be called a strike carrier, a ship that could operate by itself, not to protect the battle line, but which, during World War II, in fact, the battleships would be used to screen the aircraft carriers. And so here is a circumstance where, partly by planning and partly by happenstance, the United States stumbled on a new type of naval weapon that would be instrumental, in fact, and crucial in the war to come.
The first demonstration of the power of aircraft carriers was an attack by the Royal Navy that preceded Pearl Harbor, and may even have been a model for that raid. It came in 1940 at Taranto against the Italian Navy. The Royal Navy's torpedo bombers were able to show that even home harbors were no longer safe for capital ships. 21 Swordfish biplanes, which would not have looked out of place in the First World War, took off in the carrier Illustrious at night. They were 70 miles from Taranto, which was without radar, but had listening devices. They attacked near midnight in 2 waves, dropping flares to silhouette the targets and launching torpedoes through an intense barrage of anti-aircraft fire. One battleship was sunk and 2 damaged, as Taranto provided a devastating lesson in how naval air power could command the seas.
One of the neat things about Taranto is not only did it cow the Italian fleet, which was already paranoid of British air power at sea, but one of the nicest write-ups and analyses of the British attack on the fleet anchorage at Taranto was done by the Japanese naval attaché in Rome, who wrote a long descriptive account of how this had been done. And there is a direct line you can draw from Taranto to Pearl Harbor.
Of all major powers, the Japanese saw the future of naval air power most clearly. At the outbreak of war, they had 10 carriers and 500 naval aircraft, more than any other nation. 13 months after Taranto, they demonstrated just how well they'd learned its lessons. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor proved the vulnerability of sea power based on the battleship. .360 Japanese torpedo and dive bombers with fighter escorts attacked in the morning at 7:55 on December 7, 1941. By 8:25, they were gone. The battleships in the harbor were ill-equipped to defend themselves, let alone the rest of the fleet. In just 30 minutes, the American Pacific Battle Fleet had been rendered ineffective. 4 battleships sinking, 4 others damaged, 8 cruisers and destroyers hit, with 2,400 dead. The Army and Navy Air Forces lost 106 of 228 aircraft. The Japanese had lost only 29 aircraft, a major triumph, but they had failed to destroy the fuel reserves of the Pacific Fleet. And by luck, America's own small fleet of 3 aircraft carriers was not in Pearl Harbor that day. It seemed a small thing at the time, as the carriers returned a few days later, refueled, and immediately put to sea.
The Japanese strategy in the Pacific, I think, surprised even them. They set out in December of 1941 to create essentially a defensive perimeter to capture the greater Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere, as it later became, basically Indonesia and Indochina, because they needed the resources, and then to build a defensive perimeter around that. And what they found was that in the first 6 months of the war, wherever they pushed, the Allies collapsed. They began to suffer, as the Japanese called it, from victory disease.
in order to get the oil from the Dutch East Indies, which the Americans refused to sell to them because of their conquest of French Indochina. The Japanese said, well, we'll have to conquer the Dutch East Indies and we'll have to conquer the Philippines. Of course, that means war with the United States, but the Japanese too had read Mahan's book and believed at the time that the destruction of the enemy's main battle fleet would give them command of the seas, at least temporarily, at least long enough to erect a defensive barrier in the western Pacific that would be unassailable.
It seemed that the potential for expanding their defensive perimeter was almost unlimited. And what they end up doing is actually creating a vast defensive perimeter. If you look at the Central Pacific, it's probably so vast that even in most Japanese eyes it would have been difficult to defend, and you certainly needed a fleet to do that. It's conceivable they could have stopped their conquests in Southeast Asia and in Polynesia and done okay. They very quickly overextend themselves, largely because every time they push, there's no one there. And they really get to a point of exhaustion by about May or June.
Nevertheless, it was quite astonishing to Churchill and all his contemporaries that Japan could, in the first 6 months of the war, sweep to the borders of India in Assam and to the borders of Australia in Papua New Guinea and just throw the Dutch, the Australian, the British and the American forces, just totally throw them out of that theater.
To complete their defensive strategy, the Japanese faced one impediment: the American aircraft carriers. To lure them into battle and destroy them, Admiral Yamamoto planned an attack on Midway Island.
And his plan depended on distracting the Americans by striking at the Aleutian Islands, which would confuse us as to where the next attack was coming, and then attacking Midway Island with carrier-embarked airplanes, which presumably would entice the 3 surviving American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor to the south and work their way northward toward Midway. To do so, they would then have to cross a picket line of Japanese submarines. And Japanese submarines, unlike American submarines, were focused on destroying combatant ships. Perhaps this is part of the code of Bushido of the Japanese, but they did not feel that attacking merchant ships was a particularly effective use, maybe not even a manly use, of warships.
But U.S. naval intelligence had cracked the Japanese naval code. The American commander, Admiral Nimitz, learned the true nature and details of the planned surprise attack, and in turn prepared a surprise of his own. The Japanese plan called for a ring of submarines to be formed outside Pearl Harbor to intercept the American carriers. Admiral Nimitz made sure they were on their way before the Japanese subs arrived. The carriers then waited off Midway for the arrival of the Japanese main force. The Japanese fleet of 4 carriers began their attack on the island in the early morning of June 4th, 1942, thinking they had nothing to fear from the U.S. carrier fleet.
Americans were able to launch an early morning attack from extreme range that caught the Japanese by surprise.
Admiral Nagumo had attacked Midway once, and his planes were being rearmed for a second attack when he learned of possible American ships in the area. He ordered the Midway-bound bombers to be rearmed to attack the American ships. Consequently, the decks of the Japanese aircraft carriers were awash with fuel and stacked with bombs and torpedoes. The American aircraft had flown almost to their maximum range when they spotted the Japanese carriers. When American torpedo bombers appeared, the Japanese Zero fighters pounced on the slow-flying Americans and decimated the unescorted attack. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship, and only 4 of the 41 torpedo bombers returned to the American carriers. But the Zeros were at sea level and out of position when the American dive bombers arrived. The Japanese were poised for victory. Their carriers turned into the wind to launch their aircraft toward the American carriers. It was 10:24 a.m. on the carrier Agaki.
The air officer flapped the white flag, and the first Zero fighter gathered speed and whizzed off the flight deck. At that moment, the lookout screamed, "Hell divers!" I looked up to see 3 black enemy planes plummeting towards our ship. Some of the machine guns managed to fire a few bursts, but it was too late. The plump silhouettes of the American Dauntless dive bombers quickly grew larger, and then a number of black objects suddenly floated eerily from the wings. Bombs! Down they came, straight towards me. Commander Mitsuo Fuchi.
At 10:25 in the morning on the 4th of June, 1942, the course of the Pacific War turned around. And it turned around because of those pilots and their airplanes who put bombs on the decks of those Japanese carriers where ammunition was piled preparatory to being put on the Japanese airplanes, fuel hoses snaking across the deck, and these were wooden decks after all in those days. And the Japanese were literally in their most vulnerable position when the Americans came out of the clouds and put 3 of them on the bottom.
By 10:47 a.m., 3 of the Japanese carriers were ablaze. Later, the 4th carrier was found and struck, but not before its aircraft had attacked and crippled the American carrier Yorktown, which was later sunk by a Japanese submarine.
It's hard to find an equivalent example of this anywhere in military history, where the balance of power shifts so decisively in such a tiny period of time. The Battle of Midway was the moment when the initiative shifted from the Japanese to the Americans. After June of 1942, all of the confrontations in the Pacific Ocean would be at the American initiative, and the Japanese would be reacting to them. Up until June, Americans had reacted to Japanese initiatives. Now it's going to be the other way around, and it will stay that way right up until August of 1945.
Before Midway, American submarines had been active in the seas close to Japan.
The Americans, curiously enough, very quickly adopt an unrestricted blockade of Japan and just as quickly turn their submarines loose on the Japanese to do against the Japanese what the Germans are doing off America's own coast against them. That blockade is probably fair to say uniquely ineffective for about the first 2 years, maybe 3 years. And a lot of it has to do with the distances involved, with the small number of submarines they have available, and with the terrible problems the Americans have with the detonators on the end of their torpedoes.
The Americans didn't solve these problems for over 2 years.
The Americans come into the war in the fall of 1944 with an excellent torpedo, with trained crews, lots of subs, now a little bit closer because the front's been advanced. They also have vastly superior radar systems. The systems they have for submarines are much superior to the radar systems the Japanese have for their surface vessels. And the impact on the Japanese merchant fleet is devastating. By the spring of 1944, they're down to about 1 million gross registered tons. And they virtually shut down Japanese coastal shipping. And the U.S. Navy estimates, I did at the end of the war, that they would have driven Japan to surrender by the spring of 1946 on their own without the nuclear weapon being used.
The U.S. submarine force numbered 14,750 men. Almost 4,000 lost their lives. Out of 288 submarines, 52 were lost. Between the first sinking by the Swordfish and the last by the Torsk, U.S. submarines sank more than half of all the Japanese merchant and Navy ships sent to the bottom during the Second World War.
And the British arguably are about on par in 1939. The Americans, in terms of economic potential and industry and sort of national wealth, already ahead of Great Britain. What the British have going for them in 1939, of course, is they are still a great imperial power. They still have bases overseas. They still have influence overseas. They still have infrastructure, even if they lack the fleet very often to make it work. There's a period until about 1943 when the British lead in the Second World War, and the Americans kind of follow, in part because they're not quite ready. But by 1944, it's very perceptible that the Americans are in charge. And so somewhere about 1943, 44, the threshold is crossed, and if you like, the torch is passed from Britain as the great world naval power to the United States.
The last great hurrah of the Royal Navy occurs in June of 1944, when it spearheads and commands the greatest invasion force in history, the world's greatest demonstration of amphibious assault, the most difficult test naval power can face.
As we all know, the British had this rather poor record of amphibious landings in the First World War, Gallipoli in particular, but also at Salonika, and therefore no one really was preparing for amphibious warfare in the years before 1939. And it became clear that the only way in which Hitler's Germany could be brought to its knees, unless you left it entirely to the Red Army, which didn't seem plausible in 1942-43, was a large-scale Anglo-American-Canadian amphibious operation of continental Europe. Then the planners had to get to work.
Unlike the North African landings in 1942 and the invasion of Sicily in 1943, which were largely unopposed on the beaches, the Allies faced an Atlantic wall backed by more than 60 German divisions.
You had to have command of the air, you had to have command of the sea, that is to say, you had to have defeated the U-boat problem. This is why all of those theories about could the Allies have landed in Europe successfully in 42 and 43 are dead wrong, since we didn't have command of the sea and we didn't have command of the air. You had to have specialist equipment. You had to have an incredible intelligence system. You had to have a very, very regular supply system. And then you just need the overwhelming application of force, as Churchill calls it. But it comes about because the force is overwhelming in the air, at sea, on land, and in technology, all fit together.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the Americans attacked and occupied islands closer and closer to Japan. Working their way across the Pacific Ocean from the Marshalls to the Marianas and then finally to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the fighting got deadlier and deadlier.
Within the close range of the Japanese home islands themselves, the Americans were able to bring huge numbers of ships to bear both on Iwo Jima, which of course is a classic example of personal bravery of the Marines who went ashore and had to fight it out literally hand to hand with the Japanese defenders of that island, who were willing to die rather than surrender, in the hopes that by prolonging the war, the Americans would eventually tire of the losses and give it up.
The largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War was in Okinawa in April of 1945. It was also the bloodiest. 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dug into caves and sand tunnels in the southern part of the island, so the landings were almost unopposed.
But especially so at Okinawa, where the Japanese, now desperate of course, recognized that in order to turn back the Americans, all the stops must be pulled out, and that's when they finally made a complete commitment to the kamikaze. And that is the most intelligent, deployable weapon ever produced, a weapon with a human brain.
In the Battle of Okinawa, over 1,500 suicide flights were launched at the American fleet. They sank 34 ships, damaged another 368, and killed and injured almost 10,000 sailors. In the nearly 3 months it took to overrun Okinawa, the Japanese lost 80,000 men. The Japanese in China numbered 3 million men, but they could not get them back to defend the home islands because of American air power and submarines. American industrial power had proved overwhelming.
The United States finishes the Second World War with about 3,600 warships. Britain has the second largest navy, and it's 1,200 warships. And Canada, curiously enough, has the third largest navy in the world in 1945, and it has about 400 warships. So that gives you some sense of the scale. The Americans built about 110 aircraft carriers during the Second World War. Many of them are jeep carriers, small carriers. The Americans built 364 or 365 destroyer escorts in 1943 alone. They basically build the entire strength of the Canadian Navy in one ship class in 1 year. Nobody can compete with that.
24 days after Okinawa fell on June 22, 1945, the United States tested the first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, and 3 weeks after that, dropped one on Hiroshima. A war that had been in essence a naval war would be ended by that blast. Of the great powers, only the United States and the USSR emerged from the Great War stronger than they had entered it, and almost immediately they entered the twilight zone of the Cold War. They seemed militarily mismatched. The guard had been changed, and the U.S. Navy was as supreme at sea as Britain ever was. But the Soviet Union knew they would require a navy to challenge the U.S. Navy, and they set about building one. That navy, employing radical new technologies involving rockets, atomic warheads, and outer space, would challenge the continuing military dominance of the English-speaking peoples, maintained by sea power with only minor interruptions for over 3.5 centuries.